First of all, I just want to share an anecdote that I think sort of sums up some of my feelings. 2001, I was on one of my visits to Ukraine, and I spent some time with my brother Boris, who had been there already for 9 years. And of course, when I came in, wanted to talk to him. So what's going on? What's your sense of things? I figure, he's right in the thick of it in Kyiv. He's working in tandem with the Canadian embassy. He's dealing with Ukrainian government officials. He knows all kinds of people. And he says, Yaris, I'll be honest with you, I don't think anybody knows what's going on in this country or how it works. Even after all those years and reading the newspaper and watching television and talking to people up and down the back corridors of power and people in power and everything like that, to make sense of Ukrainian politics is not easy. And that's a lesson I think that people in the diaspora need to keep in mind, that for people who grew up in Canada, people who see things from our perspective, it is not an easy place to make sense of. I also want to just put something in kind of a little bit of historical perspective. At the same time, our community in Canada has always been concerned about Ukraine. And that went for the pioneer immigration that came here, that sent money home. Some of them went back and made money here, went back, and then came back to Canada. There was always this to and fro, who followed developments in Ukraine. When the war happened, of course, people here were very concerned about family members and what was happening in their villages and their parts of Ukraine. After the war, when the League of Nations, or when there was, the agreement was made that gave Halachina to the Poles and Bukovina to the Romanians and the Hungarians and everybody, they carved up Ukraine. Our community protested this. When the Poles reneged on all the promises they made and began oppressing the Ukrainian language and culture, our community demonstrated. They wrote letters to the Prime Minister of Canada, to the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The Polish pacification, when the Poles cracked down viciously on Ukrainians in Halachina, there were massive protests. There were protests during the famine, because of the Soviet repressions. This has gone on all along, so we're not any different than we're being consistent in terms of our concern as a community with Ukraine, and we need Ukraine. And Ukraine needs us. We have a small role to play, but an important role, I think. I want to just share some of my thoughts on the current situation, and I'll just say that by way of background that, I've been to Ukraine, 18, 20 times. My first trip to Ukraine was in 1968. I spent a couple months there in 1984. I was there in 1990. And I have gone as a tourist. I've gone on family visits as a consultant in ecotourism. I've gone to attend academic conferences. I've been an election observer. I've gone on a whole variety into different parts of Ukraine. I haven't seen all of Ukraine on all those visits, but I have come to know a very broad range of people, from people in the villages, collective farmers, villagers, farmers, writers, scholars, activists, former dissidents, members of Ukraine's parliament, cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers, bureaucrats, members of the clergy, business people, ambassadors, a whole range. So I think that my sense of Ukraine comes from all those sources and my understanding of Ukraine. In terms of the current situation, as Emil mentioned, I was also an election observer on this election, and I asked to be posted to Kharkiv, which I'd never been to, a former capital of Soviet Ukraine, and a very interesting city. I was very glad that I had the opportunity to go there. I was paired with a woman from Ottawa who was an immigrant from Russia. She was born and raised in Siberia. Her name was Maria Prokopenko, so Ukrainian somewhere way back. Russian-speaking. She had actually lived and taught in Kharkiv, which has many post-secondary institutions. She had taught there for a number of years as well. So she knew the city, and we hit it off very well and worked extremely productively together as observers. And Kharkiv was a revelation. It's even though it's a stronghold of the Regents Party, in the middle of the elections, President Yanukovych, even a few days before, paid a visit, flew in, disrupted everything in a good chunk of the area that we were working in, because one of the things that happens is security is massive around him, the army of militia that they mobilize along the streets and everything, and they even impose a blackout on cell phone use. So you can't call in or out within a certain area. I'm not sure how it's done technically, but he came in, so it was to bolster, hold the region's flag up there. It was all well timed. That being said, there were votes for other parties in Ukraine, including Svoboda, the sort of radical nationalist party. And you could see that despite all their efforts, the Regions Party, and the Regions Party, you have to understand, has learned how to manipulate the electoral process. This is not crude like it was in 2004 when there was a lot of carousel voting where they basically, in the transfer of the election results from the regions to the capital, just inverted figures and made up figures or whatever like that. They're much more skillful, and a lot of the manipulation that went into how they set things up during the election, the lead up to the elections. Emil mentioned all these parties. One of the parties that was allowed to have a representative on every commission at the precinct level was the Hungarian party. This is a party that runs a few candidates in Zakarpattia, where there's a Hungarian minority, but they won the lottery, and they were supposedly had people, on those commissions. Of course, they're all regions people, and they're paid people. So they've learned how to both do that, and they've also learned how to fix things after the elections. And we saw this in Kyiv, Emil and I, how, there are all these disputed results in a whole bunch of polls and legal cases. I went down to a place called Lubukhiu and watched some of the legal cases and watched some of these machinations where Emil showed you those forms that they had to fill out and had to sign 40 times, get 40 signatures on, and you have to fill these detailed things all out by hand. One of the things they did is that on technicalities they would reject, the district election commission would reject them, saying it's missing a signature here or this isn't quite right, so they send it back. And this is after people have been working for 28, 30 hours nonstop, and then having to go back and do it all again and come back hours later and do it again. In some cases they rejected them twice, 3 times. Basically a war of attrition, figuring that a lot of those people then say, mastitsu biholovo, and they'll go home. And then the few people who are the key people will fill it out, and the results will come out the way they want it to be. So it's hardball politics, and this wasn't a surprise to any of us, I don't think. It's just interesting seeing how it has evolved. At the same time, the results were mixed, even with all the arm twisting, the money buying, buying of people, and machinations and everything like that. The Regions Party was not able to come up with a majority, and that's a positive sign. That's something to be encouraged by. There was also, you could see they lost votes to the communists, because some of the people that had been supporting the regions over the years have actually been communists and decided to support regions because they thought they stood a better chance, have now drifted back into the communist fold. At the same time, it's quite clear that Nasha Ukraina, President Yushchenko's party, is thoroughly and utterly discredited thanks to his administration. And didn't make the barrier to get representation in Parliament. And in the meantime, you had the surprising strength shown by Svoboda. This is the extremely nationalist Ukrainian party, which in all the polls were showing that they were going to get 5% of the vote, and on actual election day they were over 10%. So they doubled the number. And the explanation for this, which I heard everywhere, is that there were a lot of people who voted for Svoboda, not because they believed in Svoboda's platform, which is problematic in some areas. They have a Ukrainian, Ukraine for Ukrainians, and a bit of an anti-Semitic and anti-Russian and whatever streak in it. And but a lot of people voted for them who wanted to stick it to the government, basically, sort of, okay, we're going to show you. And so they're there thanks to that. There's also questions about Svoboda's paternity. There's a strong belief in many sectors that they are financed by the Party of Regions, that they're useful, because having this ultra-Ukrainian party helps them to mobilize the Russified Ukrainians to come out and support the Regions Party, saying, oh, see, if you don't vote for us, you're going to have those Galicians running the country, and you know what that's going to be like. That's something that we're going to see how it's all going to play out in the current parliament, where they are a force. They do pose a problem to the opposition, because they are working with the opposition, but because of some of the statements of their leader, Tyahnabok, who's a medical doctor by profession, very bright and articulate man, who had in the past made some statements about Jews and Russians and minorities and other issues that we in our society would regard with alarm. The media, of course, the international media plays this up, and the fact that the other opposition parties are cooperating with them causes some issues for them. I don't think that they're permanent or serious, but they are a wild card in the current political makeup of what's going on in Ukraine. Now, overall, though, the situation in Ukraine is not a pretty one, as anybody who follows what's going on in Ukraine through the Ukrainian media and other sources will know. There's been a definite slide backwards, not just in terms of the holding of democratic elections, but on the human rights front and all kinds of other areas. And a move to kind of re-Sovietize Ukrainian society. And one has to understand this, that the Regions Party and a lot of that generation that's holding power were people who came of age in the Soviet Union, who identify with, the good old days, that they remember. They're youths, when they were young, and they would go to Moscow, or they would go to, Armenia or Soviet Armenia or whatever, on various functions. And so there is a kind of nostalgia for it. In the Regions Party as well, they're really a leftover of the old clans, because even in Soviet times, there were political clans. There was the Dnipropetrovsk clan, which has now been totally eclipsed and dominated and eaten up by the Donetsk clan. But there were these power centers that competed for power in Moscow and in Ukraine. And the Donetsk clan has managed to hold itself together for, using the economic resources of the area and demographics and other things. And to their credit, they have managed to maintain discipline, sometimes in a crude way. There have been people murdered there as well, and bad things that have happened there or whatever. So they know how to strong-arm their support as well. The opposition, in some ways it's healthy, of course, that the opposition doesn't speak with one voice. Just like here, there are different opposition parties, and they compete with each other as well as the party in power. But I think that what happened out of the Orange Revolution, the 2004 elections that were overturned, thanks in no small part by the international observers who came in to reinforce the demonstrations and everything in the rerun of the elections, that one of the lessons that the Regions Party learned was that they weren't going to let that happen again. And I think that in the last presidential elections, which I was an observer in Bukovina, in the 2004 I was outside of Odessa, which is all very interesting, that there were also shenanigans that went on, but at the same time, Ukrainian society as a whole, people were tired of politics. They were disillusioned by the fighting that went on between particularly Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, and the fighting that went on among the people in the administration. And so many of them stayed home and didn't vote. Some of them in those presidential elections, you were allowed to vote against everybody, and a percentage voted there. And so narrowly, the Regions Party won, with a little bit of cheating, with a little bit of suppression of voters in terms of people staying home and not voting, they managed to squeak by, and Yanukovych became president. When he became president, I think in the West, and there was a feeling that, well, you know, maybe he learned something. He went into opposition. He was defeated in 2004. He took his lumps. He stayed engaged in politics. Now he's won. That now he's learned how to do things in a more democratic way. Well, it only took a few months, and we began to see how he then started persecuting opposition leaders like Tymoshenko and Yuri Lutsenko and others. Media pressure applied on the media, and he started, the whole strategy then became to undo the gains of the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution was a bad thing, a big mistake, and a temporary blip, and they've been working to do this since then, and I don't think it hasn't stopped. But on the positive side, I think that although many people are still very disappointed, I mean, with Yushchenko and what happened, that history will judge the Orange Revolution a little more kindly because, first of all, certainly for the Yushchenko presidency, there was a free media in Ukraine. And that free media is still fighting. Despite all the pressures on it, despite there is now a generation of journalists who came of age in that period, and they're not going to give up their right to freedom of expression that easily. And so it's harder for Yanukovych and everything to control the flow of information the way had been done in the lead-up to the Orange Revolution under Kuchma still. The Orange Revolution, I think, also delayed by 5 years the situation we see now, or the situation after the last presidential elections when Yanukovych came to power, that if the Orange Revolution had failed and Yanukovych had won in 2004, Ukraine would be farther down the road to neo-Sovietization and back into Russian sphere. There's in Ukrainian society, and you run into these people from one end of the country to the other, even in deep, dark Luhansk and Kharkiv, where I was, or what, who will tell you that, you know, the Orange Revolution had a profound impact on them, and they still believed in its ideals, and they're still fighting for it through their involvement in non-governmental organizations and other things. Just to conclude, what I would say something in terms of our community and the situation in Ukraine. It's important that we take a long view of Ukraine. This is not going to be, you know, nobody, I think, who knows history knows that you don't change things overnight. You don't turn around the Queen Mary in 10 feet. You know, it's a big ship to turn around, and you don't wrest Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence that easily, and you don't put it on a democratic path that easily. This is something the Ukrainian people have to do themselves. We, as a diaspora, can provide some support. We can provide encouragement, moral, practical, and I think that as a community we need to stay supportive of Ukraine, not allow the frustration and the disillusionment get to us, because that's really what the Party of Regions also wants, and what Putin and all those guys who are clinging to power want, is they want us to throw in the towel, because then they can just do whatever they want to do. I think that it would be naive to think that Yanukovych is going to get defeated in the next elections, presidential elections. They're already figuring out ways how to get him reelected as we speak. And it won't be easy, but you know, these guys are highly motivated, because they know that if they get thrown out of office, they could be sitting in jail with Ms. Tymoshenko and Lutsenko very easily. And they're already preparing for that too. They've got money stored outside the country, and they've got escape plans and everything. But they're not going to go out of power easily. That, I suppose, is the most worrisome thing to me, that 10 years ago, I would have thought, 10, 15 years ago, I would have thought that the danger of there being any kind of violent outbursts in Ukraine were remote, that Ukrainian society had gone through a horrible century, the 20th century. I still don't think it's in the cards, but there are certain things in place. The Russian government, for instance, has passed laws that give the government the right to intervene in the affairs of other states in defense of the Russian minority if they feel threatened. This is all put in place so that they can even create some situation artificially where, somebody gets shot, a couple of people, there's a demonstration, anti-Russian, whatever like that, and next thing you know, Russian tanks roll in and say, we're here to keep the peace and to protect the Russians from these horrible Ukrainians. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian government is heavily infiltrated by Russian agents and by people who are very pro-Russian. At the same time, the Regent's Party is not a monolith either. And those guys are all jockeying for position, and having ambitions of being president, or they have their own ideas that some of those oligarchs definitely, they want to do business with Russia, but they really want to do business with Europe because that's where the big market is. Russia's still pretty small potatoes economically, and many of them, their wives like to shop in Paris sooner than in Moscow. They like their kids to go to school at Cambridge and Harvard and places like that. So they are people who are Western looking, and so it's a mixed picture of in terms of the current situation in Ukraine. For us, as a community, I said one of the things that we have done with Cook and through the World Congress, we have called for Europe to sign an agreement with Ukraine to keep pulling Ukraine towards Europe, despite all the problems, and the Europeans are listening or whatever. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government that's there, and I've had it described to me as a mixture of incompetence. There's a lack of consensus among them. They want to sort of play both sides against each other and not choose a side. Well, it's getting harder and harder to do. They've kind of painted themselves into a corner. They're under a lot of pressure, and the economic situation is getting worse, and it's going to get really ugly soon. And so all of these things are coming to a head. How it's going to play out, who knows? All I can say is that having watched Ukraine, having seen it achieve independence, bloodless, without any bloodshed and everything, in a miraculous way, that those of us who believe in God and believe that God also has a hand in all of this, to have some faith that Ukraine is going to be there, one way or another. It might have some difficult times ahead or whatever, but we got to have some trust in the Ukrainian people as well, that they will sort these things out among them given time and support. Thank you.